The Summer Games Minute, brought to you by Mass Mutual. It is one of the most coveted trophies in the world, but are gold medals really gold? Well, mostly, they're not. The gold medals given out these days are nearly entirely silver and are plated with pure gold to give them that iconic sheen. Silver medals are, of course, made with silver, and bronze medals are a combination of copper and other metals like tin or zinc. And while winning an Olympic medal is priceless, the value of the materials in the medal are not. In recent games, some of the materials used to make the medals have come from recycled cell phones. Mass Mutual celebrates women's sports history and understands the nuances in how women want and need to manage their finances. With quality product solutions and guidance, a Mass Mutual financial professional can help you plan for both short-term and long-term money goals. Learn more and get started at massmutual.com.
As you've probably heard by now, we've teamed up with BetMGM this season. We'll be using BetMGM lines to make all of our picks, and we'll have special offers for our listeners each week. If you haven't signed up for BetMGM yet, use bonus code The Athletic, and you'll get a 1-year subscription to The Athletic, plus up to a $1,500 first bet offer on your first wager with BetMGM. Here's how it works. Download the BetMGM app and sign up using bonus code The Athletic. Make your first deposit of at least $10. Place your first bet on any game and claim your voucher for a 1-year subscription to The Athletic. See BetMGM.com for terms. U.S. promotional offers not available in D.C., Mississippi, New York, Nevada, Ontario, or Puerto Rico. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. Available in the U.S. Call 877-8-HOPE-NY or text HOPE-NY 467-369 in New York. Call 1-800-NEXT-STEP in Arizona. 1-800-327-5050 in Massachusetts. 1-800-BETS-OFF in Iowa. 1-800-270-7117 for confidential help in Michigan. 1-800-981-0023 in Puerto Rico. First bet offer for new customers only in partnership with Kansas Crossing Casino and Hotel. Don't forget, if you haven't signed up for BetMGM yet, use bonus code The Athletic, and you'll get a 1-year subscription to The Athletic, plus up to a $1,500 first bet offer on your first wager.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold! Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
The Athletic.
The race is on, and Max Verstappen won a thrilling rain-hit Canadian Grand Prix, but it could so easily have been a McLaren or Mercedes driver on the top step of the podium. So what's behind this rare three-way fight, and what happened to Ferrari? I'm Edd Straw, and joining us to tell all are Scott Mitchell-Malm and Ben Anderson. Well, Scott, that was a good one, wasn't it? What a lively weekend it was, a great race.
Yeah, it was brilliant. Everything about it was just adding up to this slightly jumbled pecking order, uncertainty about who was quick and why and in which circumstances. The weather was unknown throughout. And I just had a sense going into Sunday that it kind of like, obviously a wet race, especially in Canada with that track, a wet race would spice things up really nicely. But I was excited for it either way. It just seemed really, really nicely poised. And once we got into the Grand Prix, it kept delivering. That is one of the most enjoyable Grand Prix I've watched in a long time. And despite all the concerns, we have had some good ones over the last couple of years. But I'm struggling to think of one that I just enjoyed as a spectacle and as an experience as much as that, and probably in this rule set.
Well, it had a bit of everything, didn't it, Ben? Because we had the rain, but without endless rain delays and nonsenses and red flags and things. So it all ran through relatively uninterrupted. There was a little bit of safety car interruption, but it ran cleanly. And that's what we want, isn't it? It was an intriguing race, lots of possible winners going into it. This is what we want week in, week out, isn't it? But it's great when it does happen.
Yeah, there was just doubt all the way through, wasn't there? Different people strong at different times. Verstappen not running away with it, which is the number one thing we want. And more drivers and, in the case of Mercedes, teams coming into play genuinely. and catching us all a little bit off guard as well. So it's really good to see F1 at the front condensing like this, because as Scott says, it creates greater intrigue and just keeps you on the edge of your seat.
I can't remember the last time we saw a Grand Prix in which all of the podium finishers made mistakes in the Grand Prix as well, as in noteworthy ones. Verstappen slid off the road chasing Russell. Russell had, I think, 3 different not major but significant incidents. He had he obviously lost the places, didn't he? In the first stint, he had the mistake that let Norris through, and he had the clash with Piastri. So he had a very eventful one. Even Norris slid off the road as well. Hamilton had the worst race. One of the worst races ever driven, but in his words...
Well, his race looked quite clean, didn't it? But he thought it was terrible. So it was just generally a hot mess for everybody, I think.
Yeah, it spoke to how tricky it was as a race. These ones are always... They're so tense. And there are probably few times where I watch a Grand Prix and think, I wouldn't really want to be an F1 driver right about now. But F1 races, when it goes from wet to dry, and this track as well, because the dry line on this track, in about 90% of it, shows through really quickly, and then it is just a nightmare, like fractionally off. The famous Jenson Button win here.
It looks so easy to get it wrong, didn't it? It looks so easy.
Yeah, exactly. With the Vettel mistake, and then we saw a few drivers, and the longer the race went on for, the more mistakes were happening, because it just got more parallel. It was just brilliant. It was so good.
And the best thing about it was that, again, we've seen Max Verstappen winning, but he's had to really extend himself and really deliver in every way to do it. It's not that he doesn't do that in the past, but when there's margin, it's just a little bit less impressive. But I think this weekend, and Imola showed it as well, it's so easy for Red Bull not to win. Sergio Perez's struggles show that, and it's just brilliant to be able to showcase just how good Verstappen is, because I think that's what we want to see. We want to see him pushed and having to battle, and he executed superbly.
Well, he's just won a Grand Prix in a Q1 car, so that's absolutely fantastic.
He was the least messy. He was the least messy of the front guys, I think. But even he didn't have the totally clean race.
Yeah, exactly. But it averages out as a Q2 car if you take the 2 drivers. So maybe you split the difference.
Even so, still massively impressive.
Yeah, very, very impressive victory. One of many impressive victories. But it's getting quite hard for Red Bull, and that's just what we want to see. Not because we don't want to see Red Bull winning, but it's great when it's close and you really see how good these teams and drivers are. This was a really good Red Bull team and driver victory, I thought. Now, Mark Hughes unfortunately can't be with us on this podcast. He has been following the weekend closely. He was very keen to answer the traditional question we throw at him, so he has made a little contribution to this podcast. So it's over to Mark Hughes to explain how the race played out.
Yeah, it was an action-packed race dominated by the weather and the tyre choices, and dominated also ultimately by Max Verstappen, but he and Red Bull sort of took control of it, not by raw performance, just by making the right calls and not making the crucial errors, because on raw performance, you would say that this should have been Lando Norris's McLaren's victory, but they made it one crucial mistake, one crucial lost opportunity, and that ultimately lost them the race. But once he'd made that, there were opportunities there also for George Russell to have won the race for Mercedes, but he made several key errors which lost him time and ultimately the ability to fight it out with Verstappen. So you can't really give Max Verstappen and Red Bull presence like that and expect it to go unpunished. The McLaren performance was remarkable, really, and we had 2 Inters stints and a final slick tired one, and in the first Inter's stint he came from a long way back because they'd, like a little bit like at Imola, they'd gone for a setup and a tyre pressure choice which required them to build up the performance quite slowly through the stint, but which paid back spectacularly late in the stint. And he came from a long way back to pass in quick succession Verstappen and Russell, and then pull out an 8-second lead on them in a remarkably short space of time. And it looked that was it, really. In the normal, straightforward running of the race, that would surely have been enough. But the safety car did come at an unlucky moment for him, just as he'd built up that big lead. And there was an assumption at first that he'd simply not been able to get into the pit lane when the safety car came, because he'd already gone past it. But that's not the case. There was, when you look at his inboard, it was about 300-400 meters still to go before that chicane. He could easily have got in, but the instruction didn't come, and so he didn't take the initiative either. And that was a lost opportunity, because when the safety car then picked him up on his in lap, it cost him about 10 seconds, and that allowed both Verstappen and Russell to get back ahead of him. And Verstappen had got ahead of Russell because as Russell had tried to defend from Norris, he'd had to take the escape apron, and as he rejoined, it was quite simple for Verstappen to then pick him off. And they'd raced down the pit lane together, and Max got out ahead. So that was that really. And then Russell lost further time with incidents defending from Piastri, and then which allowed Hamilton to get past briefly, which required George to repass both Hamilton and Piastri, and that lost him time to be able to fight it out with Verstappen. But I think it was remarkable that the three cars and the three teams were very, very closely matched, and the conditions perhaps helped that. That the Red Bull certainly seemed to be a bit more of a handful as the track dried. You would have heard Max complaining about the lack of compliance over the curbs again, just as he talked about in Monaco. But I think the new Mercedes does seem to be going on the right track, and the latest the new wing seems to be working quite well. But it again, the relatively the corner speeds at Montreal are quite similar throughout the lap, so that really wouldn't be all that much of a test of it's the car's former problems. A much sterner test of that will be in Barcelona, so we'll see. But certainly in those specific circumstances around Montreal, the Mercedes was very fast indeed and very competitive, and potentially a race-winning car. So yeah, that's how it all panned out, and it was a classic Montreal race, one that the weather contributed to, and certainly caused some excitement and some critical decisions to have to be made on the pit wall and in the cockpit. But it was a great victory by Verstappen, and sterling, brave performances from Norris and Russell.
Well, good explanation there, as always, from Mark. But what really stands out is how many people should have won this race. It's that classic thing, isn't it? Did somebody win it, or did others lose it? And as Mark said, Lando Norris probably should have won this race, really, shouldn't he, Scott?
Yeah, he should have. I've struggled to wrap my head around the change of heart that Norris had after the race about whether or not McLaren should have won it. Not in terms of like the opportunity was there, but could they have handled the situation differently and therefore still won the race with the... Because I watched that back about half a dozen times in the race while it was happening, and I am convinced that at the moment the safety car panel comes on the side of the track, Norris is near as makes no difference in the braking zone for the chicane, and we all know where his eyes are going to be looking there. It is he won't be looking at trackside panels there. So I just really struggled to see, unless the argument is as simple as the probability of a safety car was so high we should have just come in anyway, or I should have backed off and given myself some margin so that I had a couple more seconds in my pocket to react. I don't know. In Miami, when he got lucky with the safety car in Miami, the reason he got lucky was that it could have been really unlucky. Like, the safety car came out so late that it missed him. As well as him not being able to get into the pits, it also missed him. So he got it back. Here, this just felt like the worst possible time as the race leader to get the safety car, because if you taking that argument of, oh, maybe they could have preempted it and just come in anyway, doing that as the race leader when you've got the track position, because if there isn't then a safety car for, say, 10 more seconds or 15 more seconds, you do your pit stop at racing speed, but then the safety car's been deployed and everyone will come round and do their pit stop under caution. I don't know if that was Norris being overly critical, or if there was something in there that, as we sit and record this, like maybe I've not seen or I've missed. I just really struggle to see how that is something that can be so clearly conveyed as a misjudgment by driver and team.
Well, what Andrea Stella, the team principal, said a little bit after the race was that it was 1.5 seconds Norris was from the commitment point, if you like, to the pit lane. So he could maybe just have done it. He said what perhaps we should have done is given him a box if there's a safety car instruction. However, he said we were concerned, we were monitoring the weather because this was just at the changeover point of, is the rain going to return? They didn't want to end up on the wrong tyre. They didn't want to end up changing if they didn't need to, and they could go on to slicks later, even if the rain wasn't really there. So there are a few factors there, but he did admit the thing that they didn't do was give him a box if possible. And
they
maybe,
should have done that. They should have done that, definitely.
And then it's the question of, could Norris have got in time? Possibly, because the nature of that pit lane of all of them, even though you are in the braking zone, it is one where you could lift off the brake and hurtle down the pit entry. So maybe it was possible. What do you make of that one, though, Ben? Would you be disappointed if you were McLaren?
Yes, I think you would be, only because, as Norris says, they've got into this position now where they're consistently able to challenge for victory, and it's these kind of very marginal situations that can make or break the race. And as you outlined with that pit entry, effectively just piling straight on, aren't you, as if you're straight lining the chicane. So it buys you a little bit of extra maneuverability to get in if you need to at the last minute, compared to a conventional pit entry where you might have to completely change direction or lock up or slam on the brakes. Very, very marginal situation. Could have gone either way, but from Norris's perspective, when he had such great pace, you can see why, having looked at it, he's particularly disappointed. But really, it's a small procedural thing. I'm not sure at the time you can be totally harsh on McLaren. Like Scott said, there's a lot going on in that race. There isn't a lot of time to work with. You're the leading car. He's been looking after those intermediates particularly well. That was partly why he was in the position he was in, because they set the tyres and he'd brought them in so carefully. They had a pace advantage over everyone at that point. So there's a lot to lose if you're the first on track having to make that call and you get it wrong.
I would file it based on what you've said, Ed, as well. I would file it under something. Under something like they could have done. They could have handled it differently, but I don't think they should. They should have. It's not a 100%. Clearly, they got this wrong. They should have handled this differently. There was an opportunity to, and I think the big miss there is not having had that. Lando, if you get a safety car message and you have time to get there before we know that you have the pit entry lines you have to respect, blah, 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 then you box. That would have made sense, and then it would have been down to the team to be prepared for it, because the thing I was thinking was what you don't want to do there is make a call that you then can't react to in the actual pit lane itself. It's all well and good with the car coming in time if you but if you don't have the mechanics ready, the tyres ready for them, I would imagine they'd have been on top of that had they given that call. But it all comes back to that point. They were maybe slightly flat-footed there, and they'd have given themselves basically a better chance of doing it if they'd just been that slightly bit more proactive.
And it was an unusual confluence of circumstances. In a normal race, you have your safety car window, don't you? Your driver will be told, your safety car window is open, so you know if there's one, you come in. But because of that intersection of the rain and the conditions, is the rain coming again? Could they strike out for slicks in the not-too-distant future? All those things made it very, very difficult. And it's worth noting as well that Christian Horner, the Red Bull team principal, did say that on the second pit stop where Norris went longer than Verstappen, and there was that very brief moment where he did re-emerge ahead and then couldn't. He said he was surprised they did 2 laps longer than Verstappen rather than just the one, and it might have been more difficult because Verstappen had fired his slicks, etc. So that was another one. But the key one was losing the lead originally, because it would have been a very different race had Norris held that lead that he had, even if it would have been a safety car restart. So the margin would have been small, but he just still had control of the race. It would have been very, very different.
It's funny how it works, though, isn't it? I know that we always say sort of luck kind of evens out, but it's very rare that you see it happen, a couple of races apart, in that Norris gets his first win because of a very, very marginal bit of safety car timing that goes in his favour. 2 races later, he's ready to win again. He's actually got himself in that position more on merit this time, and just a really marginal bit of safety car timing has screwed him this time instead of the first one. And it's not absolutely identical in terms of how much he gained in Miami, how much he lost here, blah, blah, blah. But the end result's the same. He won in Miami, he lost out here.
Yeah, it was basically the inverse, wasn't it? Miami, he didn't really drive the best, wasn't really the best driver throughout that Grand Prix, but the safety car timing totally changed the picture and made him a winner. This time he was the fastest guy, probably in that race overall, but was always boxed up behind other cars because of situations that went against him. So he kind of drove like he should have done in Miami, but didn't get the reward. In Miami, he didn't drive how he should have done, but got the reward.
And I guess the other thing here is the fact that Mercedes could have emerged as the winner. George Russell obviously led the early stint from led the first stint from pole position. So that's one they'll maybe be kicking themselves about as well. Do you think George Russell could have won this one? There was an opportunity, wasn't there?
Yeah, there was. I think both drivers had an air of regret about them for the weekend. Russell more overtly in terms of starting from pole, leading early on. He had the better opportunity for the Grand Prix itself, but I know Hamilton clearly views it as a weekend as a whole as a missed opportunity, because he wasn't in the picture when he should have been for the majority of this Grand Prix, having qualified only 7th. Like I mentioned it earlier, Hamilton said that this was one of the worst drives he's ever done. I don't think it was that bad. It was unseen. It had one significant error in the second half of the race when everybody was on slicks, and it had a couple of imperfections before that where he briefly lose a bit of time, but he gained it back pretty quickly. There was nothing in the errors that Hamilton did that cost him a position or impacted his end result here. Whereas Russell did between the two of them, they underperformed. Hamilton would have had a better Sunday result if he'd done better on Saturday, but Russell would have had a better Sunday result if he'd done a better job on Sunday. He, I think, used his inters too hard in the first stint. I mentioned earlier he had these combination of offs and misjudgments, and he said he made too many mistakes and felt like he'd let the team down when he dropped as low as 5th and really wanted to at least get back on the podium. So it's a really, really rare situation, very possibly the first time it's happened with the two of them at Mercedes, where the drivers have let the car down, which has I can't think, because if I rack my brains and think of the fleeting moments where Mercedes has been on it in this since the start of 2022.
Well, it's hard to think of them, Scott. Hard to think of them. But you just it's basically the podiums, right? It's the times that like Russell's win in Brazil in 22, the times that Hamilton's chased home Verstappen on a handful of occasions. They've been there. They've always been there. They either won in Brazil or they've been hammering down the door at Verstappen, but the Red Bull finishes ahead, so they can't do anything about it. I think this is the first time that the car's been there to achieve something that the drivers between them didn't do, and it's frustrating because this weekend you needed Russell to qualify the car and probably Hamilton to race it, and then you definitely would have finished second in that Grand Prix. I think with the way it played out, what we were talking about earlier with Norris and McLaren, and I think you could have won from pole position. But even with Russell being a bit messy in that first stint, I think he still had great pace on the slicks, and making that mistake, was it turn 8? That penultimate chicane, the place where he spanked the wall the year before. Yeah, he hit the wall there the year before, didn't he? He almost did it again. That was crucial because it let Norris back through, and then he was in a chasing game behind the McLaren. But before that, he had track position over the McLaren. And in theory, the way the race then later played out, he could have gone after Verstappen, because in that last stint, certainly early in that last stint on the slicks, Verstappen wasn't happy and was complaining about some of the suspension issues that reared their head in Monaco. He was talking about it being locked, wasn't he? Not being able to attack.
Said he was going to knock himself out on the curbs.
Yeah, exactly. And if he'd done that, then obviously Russell would have been in prime position to win the race. So I think even with his sort of scruffy drive, and it was scruffy, he was probably the quickest Mercedes driver, even in race trim, and just cost himself track position too many times. And yeah, Hamilton, like Scott said, I mean, he was much cleaner, and you could see that kind of ability to manage the tyres really well through the whole race. But just coming from too far back, spent too long behind Alonso, that's what really cost him in this race.
I don't think Russell was quicker. I think there were obviously moments where he was, but there were a lot of times in that race, whether it was in clean air on the inters, which he clearly looked after. I mean, he was bottled up behind Alonso for a lot of that first stint. But Hamilton was quicker on the inters when in the crucial part of that stint at the end. He was just, as you say, way too far behind. He switched to slicks early, and his pace on the slicks in that phase was really good. His pace on the slicks in the later phase was really good. And I actually think he did quite a good job, considering he was trying to do what ended up being, I think, 12 push laps on the hards, whereas Russell had that set of mediums, I think, at the very end.
He did, yeah.
I do think Hamilton had I do think if you discount the time lost early on, which obviously doesn't work for the Grand Prix as a whole, but just purely in trying to compare them in relative circumstances or relevant circumstances, I think Hamilton had the faster Grand Prix, or was capable of the faster Grand Prix. It's just, like I said, they had different weaknesses.
Yeah, he usually is capable of the faster Grand Prix. I think that's still the prevailing narrative is still the same, that, you know, Russell's maybe edging ahead in terms of pure pace over one lap, but is still too scruffy and too hard on the tyres, and Hamilton, you know, isn't quite, well, admits he's not getting the most out of the car in qualifying. He's wavered a bit, hasn't he, in terms of like, oh, there's something going on in terms of how I'm being treated, to, oh no, actually it's my fault, I've just got to do a better job. I think he's probably still trying too hard, and this generation of cars, and the Merc in particular, not necessarily responding to his particularly attacking style at the corner entry phase, and that's costing him over one lap when you've got to lay everything on the line. But over a race stint, he's definitely still superior to Russell in terms of managing the tyres all the way through each stint, and you saw that definitely in Canada again.
They also had their good little battle at the end as well, didn't they? Hamilton was ahead later, and then Russell got past. And Toto Wolff was asked about it at the end of the race in terms of how concerned he was about that. He just said, "Oh, I've had worse."
Well, yeah,
which is certainly true.
You did wonder, didn't you, if you know, maybe a Hamilton that wasn't going somewhere else, or, you know, wasn't going through one of his more difficult moments, might have put up a bit more of a fight, and maybe there would have been a bit of contact. It was quite close anyway, when Russell kind of lost a little bit of rear grip under braking, and you wondered if they were just going to bounce into each other by accident.
I did say during the Grand Prix that did highlight this isn't a Merc thing or about these two drivers, but it did highlight an issue that I have with the way the DRS system works at the moment, because that battle would have carried on if the DRS didn't favour the driver that's just overtaken someone, which is just I've never understood why that's the case. I guess the logic is it's in case the move's not done on the first straight and then you carry it onto the second, but all you actually have is a super long back straight here, where if you're close enough and have the DRS and the car in front doesn't, you're going to get past them into the chicane. And then, even though you're offline and slow through the chicane and therefore vulnerable down to turn one, that battle can't continue because the overtaking car then has DRS for the front straight. And in this particular circumstance, when Russell got that little bit squirrely on the exit, Hamilton got the run on him and was going to overtake him again. And it was only Russell having the DRS that kept him in front. So we could have had that battle from that point onwards to the end, and Hamilton didn't give up, and he stayed within DRS range until the flag. But it would have been a lot more interesting if it was the other way around, because Russell, with the tyres he was on, was the faster car at that stage. And I thought it was just a little example of something that I just find it a flaw in the way that the DRS is sort of set up and used.
Yeah, that zone on the start straight at Canada never really works anyway, does it? It's not. I mean, most attempts to pass on that bit, unless they're comeback moves of the type that you're describing, never really come off. Even in 2014, we saw that massive shunt between Perez and Massa there. it's the back straight where everything's done. Except if you're Russell trying to go past Piastri, of course.
Yeah, exactly. But the great thing is there were 3 different cars that were capable of winning this race.
Yes.
And hypothetically, 6 drivers who ended up with Verstappen, Norris, Russell, Hamilton, Piastri as the top 5, which was just great. Obviously, Sergio Perez, the obvious omission from that, and just a terrible weekend for him. He said he couldn't get the rears in at all in qualifying, fell in Q1. Didn't really make much progress in the race, and then backed it into the wall. So yeah, pretty difficult weekend for Sergio Perez to celebrate his new contract.
You know we love talking stats here at The Athletic. Here's one that's super simple to remember. Discover automatically doubles the cash back you've earned on your credit card at the end of your first year with Cash Back Match. That means with Discover, you could turn $150 cash back to $300. That's right, you could put it towards some memorabilia you've had your eye on, or treat yourself to a premium sports network. You earn and Discover doubles. See terms at discover.com/credit card.
We'll get back to the pod in a moment, but first of all, let me tell you about Grammarly. Email, Google Docs, Slack, you write across multiple platforms and places during your workday, so delivering consistent, high-quality communication everywhere is key. Grammarly is an AI writing partner that helps you get work done faster with high-quality writing for better projects, proposals, presentations, and more. Best of all, Grammarly works where you work, so you can get more done no matter what tools you use. As a journalist and podcast host, I'm constantly writing and rewriting copy and drawing up scripts. It's part of the job, and Grammarly helps make it faster. It's got some really cool features like tone suggestions to help you strike the right balance between direct and friendly in work emails. Plus, Grammarly has a ton of other great features like advanced spelling, grammar, punctuation, and conciseness suggestions to ensure your writing is professional, mistake-free, and clear. Get AI writing support that works where you work. Sign up and download for free at grammarly.com/podcast. That's GRAMMARLY.com/podcast. Easier said, done.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
Right, Scott, talking about Mercedes as a could have won or should have won, given George Russell also took pole, we're in quite rare territory, aren't we, for this team? We're normally trying to explain why they're doing so badly. So what actually did we see here? A track-specific false dawn or something more?
There was a bit of a perfect storm about it in terms of facilitating such an impressive performance. There's a difference between them having their best weekend of the season and suddenly going from not scoring a podium to being on pole, and we're talking about them maybe they could have won the race. So I think that element of it was exaggerated. I think that was probably a mix of the track layout and the characteristics of the track this weekend in particular, with it being quite green and low grip because of all of the rain. It's been resurfaced as well. It seemed to work quite well for the Mercedes, and it also caught out a few other teams. The compromise that you need in terms of your downforce levels, how your car produces performance, the power unit characteristics as well, a lot of that would have come into it, maybe played to the Mercedes. Maybe we saw the absolute best of the Mercedes this weekend, whereas we knew that the Red Bull wouldn't be in its comfort zone over the curbs, for example, and Ferrari inexplicably went missing on, well, not inexplicably, because I'm sure you're going to ask us, Ed, to explain it. So there was that element of it. But underneath all of this is some actual tangible progress that has been, it's not come from nowhere, this performance step. It's not like they've gone from being 7th and 8th and half a minute away from the leaders. That was a few races ago. But across Miami, Imola, Monaco, here, chipping away at different upgrades, front wings, floors and front wings that work together. Very significant front wing change in Monaco that now both cars have. More tweaks here. It has it has opened up sort of the range in which that car works. It allows the car to run lower. It's found a happier balance between the low-speed understeer and the high-speed oversteer that they seem to be flipping between, depending on how they set the car up. So there is an increasing bank of evidence now to suggest that this car is being quite nicely refined. I don't expect it to be on pole position and fighting for the win at Barcelona next time out, but I'd be surprised if it wasn't in that kind of lead group. It might only be the fourth team in that lead group still, but I think it would be a respectable fourth now, whereas you think those first few races of the season when the cars were being tested at their most, Mercedes was found seriously lacking then.
Yeah, I think Scott's sort of hinting at the main problem still in not getting overexcited by this one extreme performance, partly because one team that should have been at the front, Ferrari, was missing completely from the fight, but also because the way the Montreal circuit is, long straights and basically slowish chicanes, quite a narrow circuit profile in which to hone your setup for. And I think that would have helped Mercedes. I think even Andrew Shovlin said in the preamble before the event, when they were talking about this front wing upgrade and the results they were seeing from it and the promise they were seeing from it, absolutely that's made a difference. It's propelled Mercedes probably on an ordinary circuit from clearly a drift fourth to a much better fourth, perhaps sniping on the back of the leading group. But Montreal, with the kind of extra circumstances, some weirdness going on in terms of other teams' performances, the crazy conditions throughout the weekend limiting other people's or everyone's ability to get the setup honed, it was a much simpler exercise for Mercedes to go, well, if we're struggling generally to balance the car between low and high speed, actually here we just need to make sure it's good at low speed, focus on getting that front end in. We don't have to worry too much about high speed instability because there's no high speed. So it's just straight line performance, how much wing can we get away with, and making sure that initial turn is really good. And I think McLaren noticed how well the Mercedes was turning into the corners during this weekend. So it just suggested that when they can get the car into its happy place, it's really, really good. And they've definitely improved it. But I think the circuit characteristics mitigated some of those weaknesses that they've probably not quite fully eliminated yet.
I look at it in terms of the positive thing is there's a direction that's working right.
Yeah,
and
definitely.
It's about constantly adding performance. The key thing is that, if you remember last year, rear end instability. So to work on that, two things. They wanted to get a bit more downforce produced further back on the car, get the floor working harder, get the rear downforce increased, if you want to call it that. So you
chop the front wing up to make it even easier.
Well, that's the thing, because there's another part to it in which it's all about the balance and the balance shift and that kind of thing. So these cars obviously are ground effect cars, and we talk about how close you want to be to the ground. And the front wing, of course, is this big slab. That works in ground effect as well. So what you get when the car gets really low is the front wing's in massive ground effect. So you sort of pin the front end, and then you haven't got the grip at the back to balance it up. So there's two factors at play in the instability. So they knocked a bit of load out the front wing, as it was before, with that inboard unloading, if you want to call it there, with that little strip of carbon fibre connecting it to the nose. So that was a good improvement. But then they were struggling because they'd knocked the front wing back and they didn't have the front end in the slow corners.
Yeah, an understeering pig.
And that's why they had the problem. And if they did something to fix that, as they tried to do in Jeddah for the two key slow corners, they then lost the rear because the front wing wasn't controlled well enough and it was working too much in ground effect in the high speed. So along with changes to the floor volume, floor edges, all these sorts of things, they've now got to a point where they've got a new front wing that's probably got some quite clever flexing going on in it, and that's not they're catching up by flexing and others aren't. The top teams are doing this. This is an important thing. There's always some aero elasticity. You can't be fully rigid no matter what the rules say. It's impossible. So this is fine. This is completely the right direction. It's what the top teams are doing. But they now do have something that can run the front wing well loaded and low enough when it's in a slow corner to not then overwhelm with front end grip and make the rear unstable in the fast stuff. That's the positive thing. That's the widening of the window. if you can keep that window and keep adding performance, then you'll get there. I think Mercedes have taken a step forward, and this is quite encouraging. But I'm not expecting them to go to Barcelona and be a team that will be setting the pace.
No.
There's still more work to do before on a conventional circuit they can do that.
Yeah, and conventional is the word, isn't it? They seem to be making progress by just becoming a bit more conventional and not trying to do things that are too wacky and too out there anymore. It's kind of refreshing to see that humility, I think, and it seems to be serving them well.
But it's also because they've done some other clever stuff in terms of understanding what to do. They've
not cleverer than anyone else, though. They're just catching up with that lost time, aren't they?
Well, exactly, but it's not through... This wasn't a condition that was accessible to them until they've worked out whatever they're doing with the flexibility. That's the clever thing. And obviously they haven't got many of the front wings. They were protecting them in the wet. They only had one in Monaco, so they're obviously taking a while to make. Front wing assemblies aren't the work of a moment, but there's obviously big steps on there, and that's what's really encouraging about Mercedes, and I think they're on a good trajectory now.
It's definitely clicking, isn't it? It's definitely clicking. Like that wing is proving more powerful maybe than they thought.
Yeah, it's not going to be a full storm in that I'll go to Barcelona and the car's a nightmare suddenly. Yeah. It's just I'll go to Barcelona and it won't be quite as quick relatively.
But it'll be harder to balance, won't it? Because there's just more.
Yeah, it'll be more difficult. But I think Mercedes can be fairly happy with the steps they're making. That's the positive thing. The team that will be less happy after Canada, of course, Ben, will be Ferrari. We've talked so many times this year about the progress they've made. Yeah. This was like good old-fashioned Ferrari, wasn't it? Sainz and Leclerc didn't make Q3 and they didn't finish. So what went wrong?
Yeah, it was absolute chaos, really. Well, in Fred Vasseur's words, everything went wrong that could have gone wrong in one weekend. At the core of it was that qualifying on the performance that you mentioned, not making the top 10 with a car that should, by rights be in the top 4 to 6 pretty much every race weekend, and has been so far.
Well, it won the last race.
Won the last race in Monaco. Everyone was talking them up as well with, Montreal. Obviously, it's not Monaco, but it's not a million miles away in terms of like basic profile, certainly corner types. Obviously slightly faster. They seem to have an advantage with the ride quality as well. So that was expected to help them. But the car didn't ride the curves very well, not as well as they expected. And they just couldn't get the tyres working in qualifying. Turns out that it was mainly related to tyre pressures, I think. So under-pressured, not getting them up enough for the prevailing conditions. Obviously, it was very cold, mixed conditions like Scott mentioned earlier, creating a track that started off low in grip and ramped up very quickly to high grip. So you're chasing that. A lot of the time it was a smooth surface. So they fell back into kind of tyre difficulties, some self-inflicted. It meant that, neither Leclerc nor Sainz could get the car working for the early part of the lap, and then in Leclerc's words, that snowballed through the rest of it, because once you start sliding, you just kind of continue to slide, don't you, and bleed lap time. Even with that, Sainz should have been in the top 10, but he messed up his best lap at the last chicane, so didn't make the cut. Then you're starting outside the top 10, that always makes it difficult. But in the race, they were feeling quite confident because, if you've identified subsequently that the reason you've not qualified very well is basically tyre pressures, it's quite an easy thing to correct. It's not a fundamental setup change. But of course, they never really got going in the race because Leclerc had this engine problem, which Vasseur says is not the engine itself, but more the control of the engine is the phrase he used, which suggests it was a software problem. And I think that contention is supported by the fact that Leclerc eventually came into the pits and effectively did a Control-Alt-Delete factory reset, didn't he? Sitting in the pit lane, messing with the switches, and then it seemed to fix itself. But by that point, his race was completely done. He was 80 horsepower down for 15 laps, losing 10 to 15 kilometers per hour on a straight line. He calculated it was 1.2 seconds he was losing just on the straight. So when you need to make progress in a race on a track like Montreal, losing that much time on the straights, even Fernando Alonso couldn't overcome that kind of deficit, I don't think, with his heroic driving. And so, Leclerc was on a hiding to nothing. They then still had some kind of old school Ferrari silliness, like, let's just throw the slick tyres on before the track's ready. No, we need to come back in for intermediates because we're losing so much time. So he got lapped. That was quite embarrassing. So just a race to forget for him. And Sainz didn't have the same problems, but obviously started slightly further back, didn't have a very good first lap, was just kind of never really able to get out of that lower top 10 group and unleash whatever pace was lurking in the car. Probably not helped by the fact that it was a tricky race, very wet offline. I think he might have picked up a bit of damage, and in the end, he admits he just made a mistake pushing too hard, trying to get some of those minor points. Spun off where Perez did, but instead of hitting the wall, he came back onto the track and hit Alex Albon and took him out of the race.
Zeroed in on his future teammate potentially and took him out. Not through. It was completely by mistake. But
yes, yeah. Adding to the massive damage bill that Williams is already battling with this season. Thanks very much, Carlos.
Just one of those comedy moments. But yeah, horrible weekend for Ferrari.
Dreadful.
I don't think it means a huge amount other than just it was one of those ones where everything went wrong. And that tyre pressures thing will be a consequence of the weather's been all over the place. There's been rain and cool, and it's been sunny at points, and there's points where it's been really sunny, and then 10 minutes later you're getting pelted with hail, so it's all over the shop, the temperatures and that kind of thing. So that made it difficult. That said, it was the same for everyone, and Fred Vasseur kept saying this. Yes, it was the same for everyone, and they didn't mess it up, but we kept messing it up. Was pretty much his message.
Yeah, exactly. And there were certain calls, like this. Okay, the Clerk's race was a basket case anyway, but still, not making quite the right call in terms of tyres, that you don't want to make those mistakes, even if you're thinking it's a shot to nothing. Both drivers were very unhappy with the way Ferrari played the tyre strategy in Q2 when they missed out, both of them, on Q3 by pretty much nothing. A tenth either way would have been enough. And they were on used tyres at the end of the session and felt they should have been on new, and Ferrari deliberately did that because they thought the rain was going to come in and it didn't arrive. So instead
I can excuse that because quite a few people did that.
Yeah, McLaren did it. I mean, that's what Vasseur said, and obviously both their cars were in Q3. But if your car isn't performing quite as well, maybe you need to be a little bit more on it in terms of giving your drivers the absolute best chance to squeak through in a marginal situation. Obviously, the drivers felt that they should have had the new tyres for the end when the track was at its best rather than earlier on. Vasseur called it a 50-50 call, so maybe it's hard to be overly critical, but the finer details do matter, don't they? And he's one for preaching, relentlessly working on the weaknesses and fixing the problems. I don't think Ferrari need to panic. He was stressing that message at the end of his media briefing on Sunday. We've got to stay focused and not. His phrase was, "We are not world champions after Monaco, and we are not nowhere after a weekend like this." And I think that's a fair perspective. Just kind of write this off as he would say, a shitty weekend, and hope that that's the only one you have in this whole season, and just move on. But it shows that it's so tight at the front now. If you do mess up, even small things, it can be the difference between being first or being 8th, 9th or 10th.
Yeah, good example of how Ferrari have been getting the small stuff and the detail right so far this season. This is such an extreme outlier, and I suspect it will remain so. Scott, Aston Martin, Fernando Alonso and Lance Stroll were 6th and 7th. Seeing signs of life there?
To a degree. I think there's probably, much like we were talking earlier about Mercedes and parts of this track and weekend suiting Mercedes, I think there was a degree of circumstance and track flattering Aston Martin here. There were times in the weekend, a little bit like Monaco actually, where Aston actually were threatening even more than what they eventually ended up with. The final result's really good for them. It's just a nice little bit of impetus into a season that was becoming worryingly disappointing, and especially as it followed an upgrade that seemed to make the car trickier to drive again, echoes of last season, all of that. To have come here on a weekend like this where it's so easy to get caught out, and if your driver doesn't have confidence, you end up having a Zhou Guanyu weekend where it just everything goes wrong and the driver never looks settled.
He had a stinker, didn't he?
An
absolute stinker.
And we've seen Aston's drivers have that. Alonso's had it a couple of times, so it is possible. I think it will encourage them that they've come through a weekend like this and they've been able to put the car in a good window, and that did seem to genuinely bring more out of it. But I need to see this at a proper track like Barcelona to make sure that it's not just because it's a simpler track in principle to set up and brings the best out of the car and stuff like that.
They had a pretty neat weekend in the sense that they, even in that really messy Friday sessions, they were quick, and like Scott said, simplified circumstances in terms of the track type probably helped them because it wasn't so complicated in terms of the window you need to run the car. But in the bigger picture, still pretty disappointing when you consider how competitive Alonso was at this race 12 months ago, fighting right at the front in the podium battle. Aston have fallen quite far from that. And even the end result was flattered by the fact Ferrari just went missing for what we expect to be one race only. So if you put Ferrari in a normal position, 6th and 7th is probably 8th and 9th. And they're about where you'd expect them to be. They're not in the top 4 group. They're sort of slightly adrift. And if they do well, ahead of the midfield. At least they weren't being picked off by the RBs. I suppose that was the really good news from this weekend compared to the previous ones.
I've got a rare bit of news just in for you on this podcast, in that finally we've got a decision on that Piastri-Russell investigation, which is no further action on the grounds that I've not read the full thing, but the stewards have said that no one was wholly or predominantly at fault for that one. That was when there was the Russell-Piastri thing at the last corner. So
I think that's fair.
Nothing changing on that one. Let's talk about RB now, Ben, because Yuki Tsunoda was 9th and chasing Esteban Ocon for 8th when it all went wrong. What do you make of the error that dropped him to 14th?
Yeah, a bit uncharacteristic from Tsunoda, given the excellent season he's had. I hope it's not another Sergio Perez type situation where you drive pretty well, then get your contract renewed or your option exercised, and then you just go to pieces. He didn't have the best weekend, but the race was looking like he was salvaging a pretty good result. The key thing was extending that first stint on the Inters rather than pitting under the first safety car to get onto a fresh one. Him, Ocon and Bottas, I think, were the 3 that kept their original set, and that gave him track position that he'd basically lost in the early part of the race. And then he held that right the way through, and then just, I guess pushing a bit too hard, threw it all away.
Yeah, actually, I think it was interesting with Tsunoda because I think his underlying pace was stronger than Ricciardo this weekend, despite qualifying behind him. Because if you look at it, he had a very slight edge. Ricciardo was close, but it was all just a moment in turn 2 on the last lap that made all the difference. And then over the rest of the lap, he was fractionally quicker again than Ricciardo. So I don't think it was a bad weekend. It was, but his pace was decent, probably a little bit better than Ricciardo's, and he made the mistake, so that makes it a bad weekend. But I don't see any particular change. It's just, everyone's allowed the occasional mistakes. But of course, Daniel Ricciardo had a good weekend, didn't he? Scott, 8th place. He got in the end, and he was pretty cheerful with life.
Yeah, he always is when he gets a sort of glimpse at something positive. We saw it last year in Mexico, more so this year as well, just because it has been such an otherwise constant barrage of either being just on the wrong side of a gap to Tsunoda or actually quite a bit off him. So I think you've put it quite nicely, Ed, when we've talked about this. You can see him clinging to the positive moments like quite a lot. This weekend was just, I think, a lot better. I think you're right. I think Tsunoda probably should have qualified in front. I did notice in Q1 and Q2 that Ricciardo was ahead initially, and then Tsunoda just both times would just pull this final lap out that just moved him clear of Ricciardo. And it had a little bit of that sort of Australia air and other races as well, where maybe Tsunoda can just get a bit of a pace that Ricciardo can't. But the main thing I think was that Ricciardo was still competitive regardless of that. Like he did seem to be comfortable in the car. He seemed to be getting a lot out of it. And he drove well in a difficult Grand Prix. We've talked about how so many people made mistakes. He's one of the few people that I don't think made a mistake in the Grand Prix, and his reward was some decent points.
Apart from his full start, he cost himself 5 seconds.
But I don't think that was him. It might have been a little bit of emotional management in the race, but his race engineer did say over the radio that it was a car thing, not a him thing. It wasn't an operator error. So, but there's no, as far as I can tell, there's been no extra detail on that at the moment.
they've been working quite hard in terms of trying to improve their starts because their launches have been poor. Didn't seem to really work because it wasn't a good first 30 seconds or so of the race for Ricciardo, but it could be related to that. I'm sure we'll find out a bit more about that in the future. But yeah, a decent weekend for RB as well. Now, Scott, I'm feeling like we maybe need to consider creating a new corner on this podcast called Alpine Nonsense Corner. They actually had a decent result with Pierre Gasly 9th and Esteban Ocon 10th, but still managed to find reasons for controversy.
Can you get them to do the jingle for it, like you have for the Bottas one?
Yeah, I might ask actually. I might ask. Yeah. So what happened, Scott? Because I have to ask this as well, because when I was wandering through the paddock, I briefly ran into Esteban Ocon, who I didn't speak to properly after the race to interview, and I just sort of said, "Oh, well done, that was all right." And he sort of said, "Not really." And he did say, "Oh, have a look at my quotes."
Yeah.
Which I didn't know. I didn't know what he was annoyed about at the time. But it's quite nice of him to flag. Drivers don't normally flag up to us. Oh, I said some quite interesting stuff there, but yeah, 9th and 10th, yet still an argument.
It was the 9th and 10th, but the wrong way round, basically. Ocon was running 9th with a few laps to go. He had just been overtaken by Daniel Ricciardo, and he was struggling with an issue within his energy recovery system. He'd had this issue that was impacting performance a little bit, and Alpine made the executive decision to swap their cars, ask Ocon / force Ocon to move aside for Gasly under the under the sort of intention of letting Gasly go after Ricciardo, but Ricciardo had just quite comfortably cleared the Alpines and was clearing off, so that was never going to happen with 2 or 3 laps to go. So Ocon initially said no way. He actually refused the request. Then he sort of, I think, probably realised in the context of everything, maybe I'll play the team game here. So he's offered, I'll move aside if I get the place back, because that's the done thing. If your rationale is I have to let my teammate who I'm beating on merit pass to chase after someone else, if I do that and he doesn't get him, I should get my place back. He didn't actually get an affirmative from the team on this, but he did the right thing. He moved over, he let Gasly through. In a shock move, Gasly, having been behind Ricciardo up until that point, was then not able to catch and pass Ricciardo in the remaining 2.5 laps. Ocon was basically in the process of asking, are we doing the right thing then and letting me have it back? And he got very quickly told by his race engineer they wouldn't be inverting the positions again. This was for 2 reasons, or this is how Alpine justify it. One is the issue that Ocon had. They felt that if he was compromised with this ERS issue, it was better to have the higher performing car in front just in case. And 2, by that point, there was a Haas within a second of Ocon. And that's a legitimate reason not to swap them back, because if you swap them back, guarantee Hülkenberg is grabbing one, if not both of those cars while they faff around. But they should never have made that change in the first place. That was the problem. We saw this before. I think it was in Japan last year. They botch this stuff all the time, and all of the context that's happening around it, the atmosphere, the tension, the fact they've still got this season to work together. To have pulled this, I think, there was so much self-harm attached to this decision, and it achieved nothing. It didn't risk anything. The fact that Ocon nearly got Gasly back on merit on the last lap shows that there was no performance reason to make this change.
It looks really bad as well. It looks like they're sort of just collectively punishing him again for what happened in Monaco, or what didn't happen in Monaco. And if they're clinging now to this rationale that he had an ERS problem, so that was hampering him late in the race, well, why not be upfront with that as the justification and say, look, we need to swap positions because you're in a vulnerable position with your ERS, and therefore that puts Gasly at risk from the cars behind. So if we release him, then that protects our 9-10 position from the threat from behind, because you can be in the slower car and hold them up. They didn't do that. This kind of idea that he's going to attack the car ahead, as Scott outlined, wasn't going to happen. It looks ham-fisted at best and malicious at worst.
As Ocon put it, even if you had a Red Bull, you weren't going to catch up the 2.5 second gap to the car in front immediately.
Yeah.
Yeah, and of course Ocon's sensitive about it because he's trying to show what he can do because he wants to get a seat for next year, although I think he's in a pretty good position. Sounds like he's pretty much at the front of the queue behind Sainz at Audi, and Carlos Sainz, as we discussed before, seems to be looking more towards Williams. So Ocon in a promising position despite his understandable irritation. Ben, we should briefly talk about the Haas drivers because they both started on wets and created some drama in the early stages. Kevin Magnussen surged up to 4th. Why did that lead to nothing?
I love this. This is one of the elements I loved about the early part of the race. Like one team just taking a punt on the extreme wet tyres. I mean, to be fair, the new extreme wet tyres, which seem to work a lot better than the old ones that Sebastian Vettel said were unraceable. And okay, it was fun for a while. Magnussen, having a bit of a cameo, charging up the field, got up to 4th, didn't he, at one point? But that strategy was relying on a great big bucket of rain coming back in as the track was starting to dry. It didn't happen nearly early enough and nearly at the level that they needed. So inevitably, they were going to have to pit to get off those tyres and onto a set of inters. So having started with unfavourable track position, they weren't able to take the benefit of the thing that Ocon, Tsunoda and Bottas did, which is just extend that stint through the first pit stop phase and then be in a great position to then move on to the 6 later. They had to just get in line with everyone else, but with the added harm of being on a slower tyre that was getting worse for the track rather than an inter that could potentially perform better if you extended the stint as the track was drying in that sort of weird crossover phase. So yeah, that it was never going to work once it became clear that the track was only really going to improve rather than get worse.
Yeah, the funny thing was they could have gained a little bit from Magnussen particularly doing that because he could have come out certainly 12th, maybe even 11th if they got the pit stop right. So there was a little bit of a gain there, but it wasn't one that was fully realised, unfortunately, for them. But I think they ended up missing out.
It was a nice punt, though. Fun to see.
Exactly, yeah. Haas just wasn't very good. And actually, Nico Hülkenberg had problems all weekend. He had weird aero problems, ended up going to a high downforce rear wing. Still reckoned he had aero problems in the race as well. So it's just one of those weekends that never got started for him particularly. So, yeah, difficult one for them, even though they raced reasonably well, all things considered. Right, before we get on with answering questions from our listeners, there's some exciting news about the Race Members Club. Regular listeners will know we talk about the Race Members Club a lot, and I'm delighted to say that very soon it will be available to join via Patreon. If you join us on Patreon, you'll get all the benefits we always talk about here on the show. Bonus content, including Bring Back V10s, that 1997 revisited series I've been part of recently, along with Ben, and the chance to ask us questions after each Grand Prix, the very questions we're about to answer. And when we have too many questions to fit into the show, we often record bonus episodes for our members to get through as many as we can. We'll be taking all of that to the next level on Patreon with a better podcast player experience, integration with Spotify, and we're dividing all of our bonus content up into playlists to make it easier to find what you're looking for. We'll also be adding MotoGP content and a new tier with some extra bonuses like live Q&As and the chance to ask questions about episodes of Bring Back V10s before we record them. We'll let you know when the page launches in the coming days, and I have to say I'm looking forward to it as I'm a Patreon user myself and I've been talking about us doing this for ages. So anyone else excited?
Yeah, Patreon's good. It's a better all-round experience for this kind of thing, which is what the Members Club is designed to achieve, and I'm fairly optimistic it will address, shall we say, a key round of points that have often been raised in feedback from members about what would make the user experience better. So I'd like to think that that's going to be a positive.
I'm particularly looking forward to you saying the race is Patreon.
Oh, that's a good idea. I hadn't thought of that.
Boo.
Yeah, we might have to make that part of the sell and the appeal. I mean, that'll bring in a few tens of thousands extra members, patrons, sorry, I should say now. Patrons, I need to get used to the new nomenclature. You'll still be the Race Members Club, but you'll be patrons as well, I guess. So, yeah, I think we'll stick with members. But anyway, yeah, I'm looking forward to that. And it is good we can further build a Members Club because we do appreciate everybody's support, and it's great to have the interaction and the questions. And the more in-depth stuff we can offer you, the better. And here are some listener questions indeed. Scott, first up, a question from one of our anonymous members who said, what is the group's thoughts on Jacques Villeneuve's assessment of Daniel Ricciardo? I tend to agree and have long held the same assessment post-Red Bull.
So if Villeneuve had basically ended his rant about 60 or 70% of the way through, I think it would have been fine. I think it would have been harsh, it would have been biting, it would have been Jacques Villeneuve talking about something he doesn't like. But at its heart, the point that Ricciardo has under-delivered for too long and that his image is doing more heavy lifting for him now. That is correct. That is not a controversial position to take. There was already concern about Ricciardo in 2021, the first year at McLaren, and it has only gone downhill since then. 2022 at McLaren, an inconclusive at best part season last year when he got back on the grid in AlphaTauri, what is now RB, and a season that has had more lows than highs this year, coupled with the fact that off-track elements like his profile, like his commercial appeal, experience, blah, 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 all of that stuff fed into why he is in the team and why he's getting a bit of protection, that plus his reputation, and not in a commercial sense, but just what he's achieved in the past. It's buying him some time and keeping him on the grid. He's not going to get flicked in the way a Nick de Vries was 12 months ago, that situation obviously that got Ricciardo onto the grid. But where I think Villeneuve went too far and where I feel like he was almost undermining his own point was he was basically trying, it was really weird, he was basically trying to argue that Ricciardo's never been good and that he was massively oversold and overhyped what he achieved at Red Bull. He also claimed, because he said, he just beat a burnt out Vettel who was trying too many tricks or something in 2014, and claimed that he hasn't beaten anyone since the first 6 months alongside an 18-year-old Verstappen, which massively underestimates the job that Ricciardo and Verstappen were doing at Red Bull and how Ricciardo looked in that phase. It fizzled out really badly in 18, but remember that first sort of 6 or 7 races, I think Ricciardo's stock in F1's never really been higher than that. And then he moved to Renault, where he was really good. Renault stint always gets underestimated, but he was really good there. So I'm not saying that Ricciardo was super good in 2020, so of course he deserves a seat on the grid in 2024 and 2025. My point is, if you're going to eviscerate someone's career and their current place on the grid, you at least have to be accurate with what you say about it. Otherwise, you undermine your own point, because understanding how good Ricciardo was, and also like how fairly recently he was still mega, is key to framing and understanding why it's so surprising and significant that he's this underwhelming now. Because otherwise it doesn't matter. If he's always been average, why does it matter that he's now performing averagely?
Yeah, it's a fair point. I mean, Ricciardo was great in that period. And in fact, that's probably why, during all this chat about 2026 and the new rules coming in, he was harking back to 2016 and saying he would like that balance again, because at that point he was at his best and was probably the best on the grid, certainly one of, and was constantly being linked with moves to like Mercedes and Ferrari, etc. His stock was high for good reason. But on Villeneuve specifically, I mean, in terms of drivers who've extended their F1 careers well past their best, he definitely knows a thing or two about that.
He's speaking from experience and a position of authority, not just in F1 either, generally racing in motorsport. I
can interrupt us for another little bit of breaking news. We've got some very late stewards' decisions coming through. Sergio Perez has been given a 3-place grid penalty for the next race for rejoining the track.
Being rubbish?
Well, no, they let him get away with that, but it was for failing to leave the track with serious mechanical difficulties after significantly damaging the rear wing. Yes, so that's just come through. So a grid drop for him for the next race in Spain.
So he'll definitely be 20th on the grid at the next race then.
Well, yeah, with how qualifying's been going, that's really not what he needs. Now, to come back to the questions, Ben, Kieran Bruce says, a much improved qualifying and race performance notwithstanding, when will people accept that Daniel Ricciardo has had his time and should make way for the next generation? WEC, touring cars and the like are all viable options. Why hang on any longer?
Well, why hang on? Because, Formula One's the main game in town, isn't it? And if you can get paid decent money to race in the fastest form of motorsport, fastest form of circuit racing, why wouldn't you do it? Ricciardo is a difficult situation because he's kind of at that inflection point where he's got this great track record from the past. He's trying to kind of rediscover his best form. He, whether you think he was, like Villeneuve does, overhyped in the past and merely an average Grand Prix driver, certainly now, he's still performing well enough to be in an upper midfield team and doing a decent-ish job. If the peaks of performance, like Mexico last year, like the sprint race in Miami, like Canada this weekend broadly, pretty good. They're just, for a guy of that experience and that track record, not enough peaks enough of the time. So maybe he is in the sliding position. So many very, very good drivers and more successful drivers than him have been in this position, where as their careers have gone on, they've just started to get left a little bit behind by F1 and overtaken by younger, faster, fitter drivers. But they can still hang on and do a decent job for a while and bring other things to the party that help the overall performance. Not just the commercial stuff, but a guy of Ricciardo's experience can bring understanding to what is still a small team in terms of how to get the right performance profile from the car setup and what have you. These are not as important as just doing the job relentlessly weekend after weekend in the car, and that is a legitimate question. Like Scott said in the previous answer, the part of Villeneuve's criticism that Ricciardo isn't performing consistently enough to justify his position on the grid is valid at the moment, but he doesn't look like a guy who's completely hopeless yet.
No, certainly not. The other thing I think is worth noting is that he's under no obligation to make way. The only two real factors at play are, does he want to continue, and will somebody give him a job? Now, you can argue that he shouldn't, and that they shouldn't, but those are the two key factors, aren't they? I think,
and he might be on the limit of that now.
It's possible.
If Red Bull are in this use him or lose him situation with Liam Lawson, then and they really rate him as a prospect for distant future, and they now feel like Tsunoda's consistent enough that he can be team leader, then where does Ricciardo go if Red Bull doesn't exercise the option that keeps him at RB for 2025? He's not going to have a load of options. He's going to be second, maybe third in the queue on what is becoming quite a busy, a busy part of the driver market as new guys are coming in. If Lawson comes in, plus Behrman, plus Antonelli, that's a lot of new blood in one hit, and he's going to be one of the guys certainly at the moment who'd be exposed, I think, and in danger of losing his seat if he doesn't get to keep the RB one.
The next question I'll take from Tom Kyle, who says, what sort of an influence, if any, could Carlos Sainz taking Albon out of today's race have on his chances of signing for the team next season? Albon was surely on for points today. Well, yeah, it probably did cost them points. It won't have any influence on that. I think they'll find it quite funny in terms of the way it happened. It wasn't Sainz doing anything particularly stupid. He made an honest mistake and collected Albon. Yeah, it was unfortunate for them, but yeah, it's not going to be relevant. And certainly the expectation is that Sainz will probably commit to Williams fairly soon, but he has not yet signed. So that's something that could come potentially before the Spanish Grand Prix, but isn't done and dusted as yet. Next up, Scott, a question from Justin McIsaac, who says, was Oscar Piastri's fall to fifth place a result of superior Mercedes pace, Oscar beating up his tyres, or both?
I think it was mostly down to the Mercedes. Mercedes sacrificed a little bit of track position to give themselves that fresh tyre for the final stint, the mediums for Russell, the hard for Hamilton, and Piastri was unfortunately just first in the queue to be gobbled up. And you saw at the end how quickly Russell, and with Hamilton in tow, caught up to Norris as well. So there were that was just a pace advantage that Mercedes had. I don't think there was anything in this race. Actually, I think Piastri pretty much shadowed a lot of what Norris did, just often a few seconds back. Wasn't quite as impressive, but it wasn't one of those weekends where the race ends and you think, Piastri's still got quite a lot to do here in terms of the tyres. That was just the way it played out and the Mercedes pace advantage.
Next up, a question for you, Ben, from John Ayers. Is Ferrari's horrendous Canadian Grand Prix weekend proof that the team is still not ready to properly fight for a Drivers' or Constructors' Championship anytime soon?
Well, I don't think the Canadian Grand Prix is necessarily proof of anything other than that they just had a horrendous Canadian Grand Prix for various circumstances, or various reasons, that we've outlined already on the podcast. I think it's still a legitimate question to ask more generally, but it does look like Ferrari are on the right track in that regard. If you look at this season as a whole, their baseline average level of performance is much better. It seems to be going in the right direction. They've got, new hires being made. Vasseurs' leadership seems to be working. He seems to be trusted. He seems to have shed some of that culture of fear. It doesn't mean that bad decisions won't be made from time to time. Where even the best teams have stinking Grand Prix now and again. Look at Red Bull and Singapore last year. But the key is obviously making those anomalous rather than a pattern. And We won't know, obviously, until we have a few more races, but if you take the ones we've had so far, there's a lot more to be pleased about in terms of what Ferrari's doing than be concerned about, I would say.
Next question I'll take from James Llewellyn, who says, following Logan Sargent's accident, there was yet another long delay by race control to deploy the safety car after what looked like one of the most obvious needs for it of the season so far. This seems to be becoming a concerning pattern of race control, hesitating to deploy either a full or virtual safety car following incidents, with China being another obvious example this year. Do you think today's delay to deploy cost Norris the chance to pit under the safety car with everyone else and therefore directly affect his chances of keeping track position? We are on the Norris side. Yes, if it had been a bit earlier, they'd have brought him in. I'm sure they'd have had the greater time to do it. We should say the reason for the safety car taking a while to be deployed, I did when I saw this question go and check in with the FIA. Basically, they wanted to make sure that he wouldn't restart. He was sat in the car for a while, still running, and it looked like he was trying to get going. And it was just under a minute between him hitting the wall and the safety car, which was quite long from that perspective, but they had it under double wave yellows in that sector that they felt was safe enough, and they wanted to see if he'd rejoin to avoid having to do the full safety car. And then it just so happened that was very bad timing for Lando Norris. But yeah, they don't want to throw safety cars for no reason, and because it was such a minor impact and he was still potentially going to move and trying to move, they didn't go to safety car immediately. And then we'd probably be saying, why did they throw it if there wasn't a need for one? So it's always a little bit of a balancing act for them. Scott, a question from Liam Mead. Hi guys, new member here and loving the content. A big if, but if we didn't see any safety cars, could we have seen the biggest margin of victory of the year in the hands of Lando Norris? He certainly looked after his tyres, and in the first stint, his pace was mega.
Well, welcome, Liam. I wish I had a more sort of affirmative answer for you for the first question, but I don't think so, because first of all, I think with how interesting F1's got over the last few races, it's very easy to forget how the first couple of races of the season started, when Max won by, I think, was it 20 odd seconds to Sergio Perez, and the next non-Red Bull was just short of half a minute back. So I don't think Norris had that in his pocket, but he certainly did look very impressive in that first set. And I think he was building up enough of a lead that in a straightforward race, a race with no interruptions, I think he would have been able to manage that pretty comfortably to the end. And I think even if he'd held track position, I suspect he had enough in hand to then hold that track position. So you're probably looking at a race that Norris wins either by a couple of seconds, or if there's no interruptions and he builds on that early advantage, half a dozen seconds, something like that. A bit like Miami when he stretched out in that final stint and beat and won by, I think it was around 7 seconds. But no, I don't think we were, unless Norris was going to revel in the free air so much that he added half a second a lap over Verstappen and the cars behind. I don't think we were looking at a half-minute win.
And Ben, also on the McLaren race, Luke Spiker says, did McLaren miss a trick by not pitting Piastri and or Norris on the second safety car, as they might have had a better chance of defending versus Mercedes or even attacking Max for a win?
Well, I think it's possible, although effectively what they did was the defensive move, wasn't it? They asked Piastri if he could have gone quicker, if they let him pass Norris, could he attack? And he was like, no, I've got my hands full keeping the Mercs behind me. I think that was the sensible call. Have him as the roadblock. That allows Norris to build enough of a buffer that even once the Mercs do get through, there's too much distance to make up. If you pit Piastri, yeah, potentially he can attack the Mercs and distract them, but again, then they'd be in the situation where they've got one as a rear gunner and then one going forward. Norris is then more exposed to what did seem to be, in the dry at least, perhaps a slightly quicker car. If the race had been intermediate all the way through, I think the McLaren would have been, certainly Norris's McLaren would have been way ahead. But in the dry, they were pegged back slightly. So I think the way they played it was probably about right, because you're prioritising your faster car with the better result, protecting that, and then hoping that your other one can just fend off these fresh tired, quicker cars from behind who've got the benefit of, effectively, with one of them, a free stop. With Russell, they sacrificed a bit of track position, but he was struggling on those hards, wasn't he? And had gone off earlier. So I think you needed a roadblock McLaren to delay those quicker cars.
Question I'll take from Edward Graff. Canada is really turning into one of the more exciting tracks in recent years. What specific characteristics do you feel make this one of the more exciting street circuits? Well, unusual configuration, close proximity of walls, those brisk chicanes that invite you to just push them a little bit more, and then you can clatter over the curb and end up in the wall or lose it. Or there's all sorts of ways to get things wrong here. Good long straight down to the last corner to overtake on. It's a bit of a bumpy track. They resurfaced it this year, so that was a bit of an unknown as well. It's just a good track in terms of being quite old school as well. But it's not really a street track. I don't consider it a street track. It's sort of a parkland track almost. Obviously, this is an artificial island and it runs around the rowing basin. And it's a strange one.
It's a bit like Melbourne in that sense. Kind of not quite fully street, but it's got the walls, a bit of gravel, but it's quite well contained. Perilous if you get it wrong, but I think it's got that added element of being a bit low downforce, because you can't just whack full wings on and have the extra grip. You've got to balance out for the straight line sections, so that makes it, those chicanes are therefore a bit more difficult.
It's got the it's got the weather factor as well. This isn't a race where you're once every 20 years you might get a wet race or something like that. It's always one of those races where you're like, it just could. And
it's either wet, windy, cold, or all three.
Yeah, and was it on was it on Friday before FP1 where like not half an hour before FP1, maybe about an hour and a half before FP1, it was sunny, clear skies, bright, warm, and then half an hour later it was stormy and hail, and there was a hailstorm, and the track just got absolutely soaked. FP1 had to basically had a delayed start, even though the session started. The pit lane was closed. Like
hospitality units were flooding, I think, weren't they, Ed?
Yeah, that's just that's just part of it, right? Like you think of the famous race here that I mentioned it earlier, but the Button win, and we've had plenty since then. It makes a lot. It makes a lot of its own kind of variables. It's not just. It has stuff like the weather that can be a nice little factor, but the nature of the track and everything around it creates variables that can sort of like proactively influence the race, rather than just, you're waiting for something magic to kind of happen that happens sort of like once every few races.
Question from Dan Lyons. We'll throw at you, Ben. Lewis Hamilton is continuously referring to an expected 2/10 deficit he has to George Russell in qualifying, but being vague around the reason. Is he purely admitting that George has the edge over him during a qualifying lap, or is he suggesting it's something Mercedes are doing with his car?
Well, I think he's flip-flopped between those two positions, hasn't he? At some points, he's feeling like there must be something different, especially as he's in this kind of weird transitional exiting the team season, where obviously they're going to favour Russell with upgrades, information, future decisions, etc., and start to close Hamilton out of the loop. And then other times, like this weekend, he kind of holds his hands up and goes, actually, the time's there if I just do a better job and clean up my driving. I mentioned before, I think he's generally struggling a bit with, not with this Mercedes in particular, but maybe a little bit in these rules generally, being able to utilise his main strength on corner entry and really braking late and attacking those corner entries. These cars, being so rear biased in how they make their downforce and being so heavy and what have you, and stiff. I don't think he gets that feeling from the front end and that responsiveness that he really needs. And that's the bit he has to work on. I don't think he's necessarily fundamentally slower driver than Russell. They're obviously very evenly matched and have been during their time at Mercedes. But I do think Hamilton is not showing the best of himself at the moment, and really generally under these rules.
And the final question I'll take from Annie Kramer. What can we make of Red Bull's seeming loss of form in the last few races? While Max won in Imola, his victory there was comparatively hard-earned. Red Bull's difficulties in Monaco were well explained, but what do we make of Max's battles with George and Lando in Canada? Is this a clear case of McLaren, Mercedes and Ferrari making development strides, or is the Red Bull actually regressing in some as yet unexplained way? Well, James Allison did suggest their recent upgrade was a downgrade, but I think as we talked about before, it's just down to the weaknesses being exposed. When you've got a bigger advantage, it's easier to absorb those weaknesses. And as others are getting closer, they are developing better, the cushion goes. And so you do have weekends like Imola where Verstappen really made the difference between winning and not winning there with good execution, and the same here as well. So I think it's just closer, and Red Bull are boxed into a bit of a corner with their car. We've talked about this after the last race, after Monaco, with the very stiff kind of lateral stiffness at the rear they have to have, and they get to a point where to run over the curbs, if they're really aggressive, if you run it really compliant, you lose all your downforce. Whereas you could probably find that a year ago they could do that and give away a load of downforce and make it compliant, and they were still way quicker. And then they were 0.3 faster rather than 0.7 faster or something. But suddenly, if you've got a car that could be a little bit faster and you get into that problematic zone, you're struggling more. So I think that's what we're seeing here. If I had to put money on it, I would say that come Barcelona, it'll be a bit closer to business as usual. By which I mean, I suspect the Red Bull will be the best all-round car. I could be wrong. I'm very interested to see how it pans out. But I suspect, that will show if that's the case. But I think the others will be quite close as well. So this, I think, is what we're seeing. And then it becomes a question of, as others develop along their pathway, and everyone's got slightly different concepts with their cars and the way they run, how they're achieving it, it may be that there's a limit engineered into the Red Bull that's a little bit lower than some others even. And this is still effectively the same car. I know it looks a little bit different, that was so good last year. I mean, there's a straight line back to 2022 with this car. So it's all a relative game. That's the thing. And it's not that the cars suddenly become bad. It's just that they've had limitations that are being exposed by, Imola's quite a curvy sort of circuit. Here is as well a weird track in Canada. Montreal, complete outlier, one of the most extreme circuits. So that's what I think's happening. But it's good because it is all coming together at the front.
Yeah, Barcelona, like you say, will be the big test, because if they're just miles ahead there, then you go, okay, so it's just been a few kind of outlier circuits or outlier weekends.
I don't think they'll be back to breezing off into distance by 40 seconds.
And if they're not, then maybe they are into that kind of diminishing returns thing that Horner's been repeatedly warning of. Like, it happened, didn't it, with Merc and Red Bull in the previous rules cycle, where the Merc just kind of hit the upper limit of a concept they've been developing for ages and ages, and then Red Bull kind of just, after having a few kind of very specific problems, kind of got their act together and were just much earlier in the journey of their own concept, and those things kind of overlapped at the perfect time, and they were able, with obviously a bit of help from some of the rule tweaks hurting Merc a bit more, to smash through and make a championship fight out of it. And you could be seeing the beginnings of that phenomenon, or a similar phenomenon, where Red Bull are just kind of jutting up against the upper ceiling of their own concept, not making as much gain. Obviously, all the cars are improving all the time, but like you say, it's a relative game. So if they're not making as much as they were previously with updates, and then also those updates are making the car trickier to set up and drive, while others are just having a more fruitful time because they're coming from a lower place, then that potentially makes it really exciting for everybody. Yeah, the trend is very, very good. But we'll get a good run of more normal circuits. Barcelona, Red Bull Ring, Silverstone, Hungary, Spa are coming up now before the August break. Fairly rapid-fire run of races there. So that's going to be an interesting test. And I think we'll see things being quite close. I don't think it's going to go back to the first few races. Big test for Red Bull. And they've got a trump card. Well, they've got two trump cards. One is Max Verstappen, and the other is how well that race team executes, because they are very on point, that whole race team, everyone in the garage, engineering staff, a really, really sharp racing team. They've not just been running a really quick car averagely, they've been running a really quick car exceptionally well for the past few years. And that running exceptionally well and driving exceptionally well become more important when it's so tight. So yeah, I think we'll probably see the best of Red Bull and Verstappen, despite the fact it might be a little bit harder. Well, thanks very much, Scott and Ben. Loads to read on therace.com, so head to our website and don't forget the hyphen if you're heading to that. Listen to some of our other podcasts, including Bring Back V10s that tells classic F1 stories, and check out our YouTube channel as well. Loads of videos to watch there. Well, we've got a couple of weeks now to the next race, but stay with us for everything you need to know from the world of Formula One.
The Athletic.